We're going to resume. I just want to check and make sure our commissioners are here. And so we'll just wait for the commissioner. Oh, great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the hearings of the International Commission of Inquiry on Systemic Racist Police Violence Against People of African Descent in the United States. These hearings are a forum by which witnesses can present accounts of the unjustified killings and maimings of Black people by police officers in the United States before an international panel of human rights experts. My name is Priscilla Ocen, and I am the rapporteur for today's hearing. We will be joined, in today's hearing, will explore the case of Juan May. Presiding over this hearing today is Sir Clare Roberts of Antigua and Commissioner Hannibal Uwaifo of Nigeria. The witnesses for today are Attorney Anthony Eiland and Jindia Blount, the sister of Mr. Juan May. There will be 50 minutes for this hearing. Witnesses will testify, followed by a period of questions from commissioners. I will call time at the 30-minute mark and also at the 45-minute mark, so I hope that you'll excuse my interruptions. Commissioners Roberts and Uwaifo, I now present our first witness, Mr. Eiland. Mr. Eiland, before you speak, can you confirm your name?
It's Anthony Eiland. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you. And Mr. Eiland, do you promise your testimony to the Commission of Inquiry will be true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I do.
You can proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. As I stated before, my name is Anthony Eiland, and I was the attorney that worked on the Juan May case. And just to kind of give you all some background on the case and some of the legality issues that we had to endure during this process, I'll go over that information with you. The incident occurred on June 21st of 2014 around 9:30 p.m. And essentially this particular night, it was a celebration, a birthday celebration, where several individuals got together and they rented a party bus and had different excursions throughout the city in that particular day. And at the end of it, they were all to meet at the Papado's Seafood Kitchen out in Duncanville, Texas, where everyone would disperse and go home. At some point during the night, there was a disagreement that ensued regarding some of the individuals that were there. One of the individuals was Juan May, our client, whom he got into an argument with Cedric Andrews, who is the defendant in this case. And Cedric Andrews is a police, or at the time anyway, was a police officer. And during that night, of course, he was off duty, but at some point there was a disagreement that occurred between Patrick May and Cedric Andrews. And as there was some back and forth going on between the two, a fight ensues. And as a result of it, Juan May got involved and tried to break the two up, because at this point, you're at a party, you're trying to have a good time. He didn't want people to be fighting. And as he was attempting to break up the fight, then Mr. Andres then struck Mr. May, Juan May. And at that point, once he struck him, then those two began to fight. Now, this fight extends outside the bus, and it lasts a few minutes as other people are standing around watching, kind of seeing what's going on. The fight ends. And as the fight ends, at some point, Mr. Andres decides that, okay, I'm gonna go get my gun. He announces himself as being a police officer, and he's gonna go and get a gun. No one else outside was armed, had any weapons. The fight that had taken place minutes before was strictly by hands. And so as Mr. Juan May hears that he's going to get a gun, he decides, look, we need to de-escalate this. He does not need to be getting a gun. And he tries to basically catch up to Mr. Andres to prevent him from getting a gun and hurting anyone. As Mr. Andres gets to his car, Mr. May is behind him and is trying to get his attention to stop him from retrieving a weapon. And so as he does this, Mr. Andres he unlocks his car door, gets inside his vehicle, pulls out a gun, comes up and immediately shoots Mr. May. Mr. May falls at that point, and that is the injury that he ultimately died from. Now, the issue that we had was when Mr. Andres announced himself as being a police officer, we argued in court that, of course, that was him invoking his police powers. And he decided at that point that he was going to operate under the color of law as a police officer. And before the court, in all of their filings and in their arguments, they never denied that he had adopted his police duties. And so he was, in fact, operating under the color of law. The issue that we had was, and in all of these cases, I see that this is a problem here in America as far as being able to successfully argue and successfully hold these municipalities accountable is qualified immunity. And so basically qualified immunity allows for police officers to, and for municipalities to hide behind that particular law, which basically states that if you're operating within under the color of law as an officer, and you're essentially exercising your duties and your abilities as a police officer, and it's reasonable for other police officers to have responded in such a way, then the city, the municipalities, and the police officer are not to be held liable for those actions. And so that was what we had to try to overcome. And unfortunately, that was the argument that was difficult for us to sustain, because the way that the judge played it out in front of in the court was, well, when Mr. May approached Mr. Andres after the fight was over and was trying to, quote unquote, de-escalate the situation and to make sure that he didn't retrieve a weapon. Well, how did the officer know that he wasn't trying to inflict any additional harm? How did he know what he was attempting to do? Wouldn't a reasonable police officer in that situation feel like, hey, I feel threatened at this point? And so he felt, they're saying that, he felt, I guess he was justified in retrieving that weapon. We argued that that wasn't the case. We argued that, number one, Mr. May never possessed a weapon, and everybody out there knew that he didn't have a weapon, and that the fight that had taken place between he and Mr. Andres was over. And so in knowing that it's over, and knowing that he didn't have a weapon, and knowing that in his attempts to approach him as he was walking to his car, it was all to de-escalate and to say, hey, you don't need your gun. You don't need a weapon. Look, this is over. Let's everybody go home. And so, essentially the court disagreed with us, and they sided with the city, saying that, it appears that it was reasonable for any other police officer under those circumstances to have retrieved a weapon and committed the act that he in fact did. And, as I follow these cases around the country, you always see that. You see that, they're always giving this deferential treatment to these police officers and to these municipalities. But in fact, the problem is with the types of police officers that they have on the streets, and if you're trying to hire good people, or if you're trying to put good officers on the streets, you're going to have to start holding some of these cities and these municipalities accountable, because as it stands right now, a police officer is able to do whatever they want to do, and the city can hide behind, oh, qualified immunity, which in fact is a made up law by the court system, and they're not held accountable. And until these municipalities start being held accountable for hiring these subpar people to be police officers, you're going to continue to have these instances where innocent people are being killed. And so, I don't want to talk too much. I'll give some more information later on, but I want to give Ms. May an opportunity to give, her account of the events that took place out there, because she was there. But as far as how all of this played out, something has to happen. Something needs to change as far as the law is concerned, because these cities need to be held accountable.
Am I allowed to speak?
Ms. May, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I didn't know if I was to wait for someone to.
Professor Ocen?
Yes, sorry, I dropped out. Apologies.
Ms. May, Mrs. May
Yes.
is waiting to speak.
Okay.
Professor
Hi, my
Ocen-
name. I'm sorry.
Let me just introduce you, Ms. Blount. Apologies, you got kicked out of the meeting. Our next witness will be Jindia Blount, who is the sister of Mr. May. Ms. Blount, can you confirm your full name?
Yes, Jindia Juan Blount.
I'm having trouble hearing you, so I'm just going to invite you to begin your testimony.
Okay. Hi, my name is Jindia Blount. I am the sister of Mr. Juan May. And I just want to start by saying thank you to all of the commissioners and the attorneys and all of the dignitaries here. Thank you for this platform and the opportunity to be able to speak my truth regarding my brother's case. So my testimony is a little bit different from, there were 26 people on this party bus that attended this party for my cousin on the night of June the 21st. I have a different vantage point. So I see this through a different lens because I was there, because I attempted to render aid to my brother and was unsuccessful. So throughout that night, Anthony is absolutely right. We did go to several different venues to celebrate my cousin's birthday. Mr. Andres was on the bus, but he was a civilian at that point that no one knew was, nobody knew. I had never met him before. I didn't know he was an officer. Neither did my brother. So on our way back to our rendezvous point, which was Papa Do's Cajun Kitchen, Seafood Kitchen, there was a verbal altercation between Thedrick and my cousin Patrick. And in that verbal altercation, my cousin jokingly said to him, why don't you get on the pole and show us some of your moves? And Thedrick's response, he uttered some homophobic profanities that I care not to repeat on a platform such as this one. And on the ride back, the air just got really thick. And you could, hear that Mr. Andres was really upset by the notion of him dancing on the pole on the bus, which was meant as a joke. So to kind of diffuse the situation and lighten the mood, my brother kind of got up and grabbed the pole and started dancing to try to, make people laugh and make the mood a little bit lighter. But when we were on the bus, I was actually seated next to Mrs. Andrews, which is Cedric's wife, and he was seated next to her. And I could hear him telling her, oh, they don't know who they playing with, these N-words, don't know who the F I am, blah, blah, blah. But I didn't think anything of it. And afterwards, I actually dealt with guilt from that, from not picking up on the fact that he was really, really angry. So we get back to Papados, and when we are departing the bus, my cousin Patrick and my cousin Robin were the first two to get off the bus. And then Cedric and his wife, they depart the bus along with some other people. And my brother, they get off the bus, him and his fiance. And I am on the bus. Me and my husband, we're still on the bus, helping to clean the bus so that my cousin Edwin won't get a charge for any debris or trash that's left on the bus. We want him to get his full deposit back. So as I'm stepping off the bus, I see my brother with these 2 buckets of drinks that he had provided. It was like margarita drinks that come in the bucket. And he's got the bucket in his hand and he's looking over his shoulder. And my cousin Patrick is letting him know that Cedric is approaching. So as he looks over and he sees Cedric approaching him, he puts down the margarita mixed bottles. Mind you, I'll rewind for a second. When Cedric called my cousin Patrick the homophobic profanity word on the bus, it made me uncomfortable. I was very uncomfortable, but I just had no idea what was going to take place. I didn't know that it would escalate to something so violent and so tragic for me and my family. So when Juan saw that Cedric was approaching, he put the margarita bottles down, and I'm stepping off the bus. He had his trunk open because he was about to load it into his trunk. The bus was blocking my brother's car in, so there was nowhere we could go. So Cedric approaches my brother, and my brother walks up to him. He's like, man, look, we had us a good time tonight. We're not even going to do all of that, whatever. Let's just go home, and we had us a good time. And Cedric said something to my brother, and whatever he said to my brother did hit him, and a fight ensued. Okay, so there was a fight that took place. My cousin Patrick walked over and he pushed the 2 of them apart. When he pushed the 2 of them apart, Cedric then hit my cousin and they began to fight. Okay. But at no point did this man lose consciousness or anything like that. When the fight was over, my brother was walking towards his car, which again was blocked by the party bus. Cedric Andrews made a mad dash for his car. His wife yelled out, there's a gun in the car, there's a gun in the car. She unlocked the door with the key fob and he ran towards his car. When my brother heard that there was a gun in the car, he ran after Cedric because he didn't know there was a gun in the car. But when he heard that, he ran to try to stop him from getting to the car. I'm his baby sister and only sibling. His fiance, his brother-in-law, and about 4 or 5 cousins were in that parking lot. So I was asked during grand jury, why do I think my brother ran towards Mr. Andrews? My response was, I can't answer that. I would be speculating. But the grand juror asked, he said, no, I want you to speculate. So my answer was and still is, as a trained combat Marine, he was trained to enclose on the threat and engage the enemy. At that point, when a gun was introduced, that was, in my humble opinion, what he was trying to do. He didn't want a gun to be introduced into a parking lot where all of his family and friends were. Okay, so that is still my testimony. When Juan went to grab Cedric, he went to grab him and pull him away from the car, and he was able to reach down with his other arm and still reach down into the car and come up, and he shot my brother. Now, from where I was standing, when the shot went off, I couldn't tell right away if the shot just went off or who was shot, because it took a few seconds for my brother's body to collapse and fall backwards. I ran towards him, but as I was trying to run towards my brother, I stopped because after Mr. Andrews shot my brother, he had the gun in his hand. He stepped over him and he was looking like he was looking for someone else. So in that moment, I froze. Now my husband and my cousin Patrick were both wearing a white top that night. So I saw my husband come and I saw Mr. Andrews peep at my husband, but my cousin Patrick had already left. Okay. So it really made me, it really made me fearful. But by the same token, I still felt like I needed to get to my brother to try to render aid. My cousin Edwin was talking to Cedric to try to get the firearm from him. Meanwhile, me and my brother's fiance, we got down on our knees. I tried to stop the bleeding. I tried to do CPR, but there was nothing that I could do to render aid. When the police arrived on the scene, they came from both parking entrances to the parking lot. And they pretty much just walked around and snapped their gloves, but no one got down and tried to help and render aid with me and my brother's fiance. So my attempt to render aid and save his life was unsuccessful. The ambulance came, but Arlington Police Department also showed up on the scene. Now, I was there. I was near my brother. I was not far from where the fight took place. And I also chased him when I saw that he was trying to stop this man from getting this gun. At no point that night did I hear him introduce himself as a police officer. All I heard was his wife say, "There's a gun in the car, there's a gun in the car." And I heard a shot go off. I didn't hear anything come out of his mouth that night. And that was and still is my sworn testimony. This has been the single most tragic thing that my family has had to endure, because as a result of my brother's death, you know, we've had subsequent tragedies. For instance, my grandmother willed herself that she did not want to live in a world without her firstborn grandson. She stopped eating and she did die 90 days after we buried him. You know, my mother is a broken woman and my father is but a shell of the man that he used to be before he lost his only son and firstborn child. So my brother left behind 2 daughters and a son who's also a Marine, just like his dad was. But, you know, those girls, their dad won't be here to see them walk down the aisle. You know, my nephew, he's got 2 babies on the way. My brother is going to be a grandfather. He will not be here to witness that. So like the totality and the way that this has caused the continental divide in my family, I don't think when these cases go before the courts, they talk about just that one aspect of the incident that took place. But I don't think that anyone really takes into account the broad spectrum of how this negatively impacts families.
Thank you so much for your powerful testimony, Ms. Blount. And let me just extend our condolences to you and your family for not only the loss of your brother, Juan May, but also for all of the tragedies that have followed. I'm going to now ask our commissioners, Mr. Roberts and Mr. Uwaifo, if you have questions for our witnesses. So I will turn it over to our commissioners for their questions.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Commissioner, you are muted.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'd like to join Professor Ocen in giving my condolences to Mrs. Blount on the tragic way in which she lost her brother. It's the suffering, as I understand it, is not just with her, but the whole family would have been broken. So our condolences.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask Mrs. Blount, in terms of justice for your brother, what would you consider that justice? I know there's nothing that can bring him back, but what would satisfy you that there has been some justice in the in this awful situation?
Well, I really think that what you just said is very important. Nothing can bring my brother back. However, I would like to see some type of accountability. I want admission of negligence, of dereliction of duty, of carelessness. The loss of a life has happened and no one can bring him back to us. But I think the evasiveness, and I think there's no admission of guilt here. I want, someone to hold this individual accountable, because one thing that my mom wanted, she's like, I'm a Christian woman. I have forgiveness in my heart. I just want to know of all the other options that he had, placing him under arrest, leaving, going home. What made him decide to take my son's life? And I just wanted answers to those questions. Allow him to answer those questions, accept accountability, an apology, just accountability and acceptance of the fact that alcohol was involved. You were not acting within the scope of the law. I don't care what anyone says. I was there. Okay. And, there are some things surrounding the incident, surrounding the firearm, surrounding your service jacket, that shows that this is not the first time that you've done this. Maybe some education on for future officers that are coming up, sensitivity training and education on how to transact in those types of environments where it won't end up with a loss of life.
Just one very quick further question, Ms. Blount. Has there been any effort on the part of the state to honor the memory of your brother since this incident?
No, sir. The only honor of my brother's legacy has been done by a group that I advocate with here, called the Mothers Against Police Brutality. And we do an annual event called the Voices of Grief and Struggle. And I've done, my best, the best of my ability to keep his story alive and to advocate and to make sure that no one forgets his story, because his case does not fit into that box of, his story does not fit into that box of like a uniformed officer and someone that was pulled over that lost their life. So I've always felt like I've had to work a little bit harder because it doesn't fit it into that box, if you will. And so a lot of people don't really consider this an officer involved shooting, but it still involved the abuse, misuse, and overuse of power, because he was given that, because Frederick was given that preferential treatment, in that, case in point, Arlington Police Department showed up at the scene of the crime, and we were clearly in Duncanville jurisdiction. So they had no jurisdiction there, but they showed up and they were asked to go home. Not asked to go home, but they were told to leave. So there's just, there are muddied waters there. There's no clear, concise set of regimented rules, if you will, when it comes to off-duty officers, if that makes sense.
It certainly does, Mrs. Blount.
All right, thank you very much. Let me join my fellow commissioners, Clare Roberts and Professor Ocen, to express the condolences of the African Bar and I on the death of the brother. Mr. Eiland, I wanted to find out something from you, somewhat another very curious case. a policeman who was not on duty shows up at a party. There was some kind of trouble between friends, whoever they were there at the party. And he goes to his car to get a gun. Was he not discussed in court for what? What was he getting a gun for?
Right.
Because elementary law tells us, a man is said or a person is said to intend the natural and probable consequences which flow from his action. So if you went to get a gun, when all the people at the parties were not holding guns, and you are a policeman, and you do not have the training on how to settle disputes among friends in the party, and all you knew was to rush to a car to get your gun, what were the arguments in court? Somebody got shot and killed. Not because they had guns or the people involved were fighting with guns, but who nobody knew was a policeman. Bring this type of argument out in court.
It kind of broke up there towards the end, so I didn't hear everything that you said towards the end. I apologize for that.
So I think I caught most of the question. I think the question was, one, the defendant here was not in uniform, not a sworn police officer, and the fact that he is an officer, was there not training about how to handle these kinds of situations without, using a gun or deadly force? Mr. Uwaifo, Commissioner Uwaifo, if I've misstated that, let me know. You can add to that if you like.
Yes, no, I that's part of the question, but I wanted Mr. Eiland to answer specifically what were the arguments in court. A man goes to get a gun when there was no gun in the party. For what? Was he not able to answer the question?
Anthony, did he?
Yeah, so Commissioner, thank you for that question. And as far as the arguments in court, so number one, there was the issue of him being an off-duty police officer, of course. He wasn't in uniform. I think some of the people there knew that he was a police officer. I don't think everybody knew. But following the fight, the scuffle that had occurred that night, apparently that's when he announced himself as being a police officer. So at that point, everybody, okay, we know he's a police officer. Now, there is case law that shows that even off-duty police officers can enjoy the benefits of qualified immunity and operating under the color of law as long as they announce themselves. And so once he announced himself as being a police officer, even though he was off duty, then he was able to basically adopt that argument in court, which is what his attorneys were shooting for. They wanted to do that so, to cover him and to also cover the city so that they wouldn't be liable. So once they were able to adopt that and implement that, then we move on to the latter part where he rushes to his vehicle to retrieve a weapon. And so, yeah, in court, we did argue that. We argue, hey, all this training that he's had, as a police officer, using an actual weapon is supposed to be the very last resort. That's not your first resort, especially in situations where no weapons have been exhibited. Nobody's shown to have any guns or knives or anything like that, which during the course of this, the fight that had preceded this, nobody had any weapons. And so in that situation, and we made that argument to the court, what is the point? Number one, the fight that had taken place was over. And number two, how is there any avenue for them to be able to argue that he was justified in retrieving a weapon in a situation that didn't call for a weapon? And basically, I sat in front of the court. We were there for about 3.5, 4 hours that day arguing. And, the other side, they kept saying, well, when he went to his vehicle, he was going because he felt, he was in danger. He was threatened. He didn't know that the fight was over. And that's basically how they always argue. And in all these other cases that we've seen, these police officers are always saying how threatened they feel and how under so much duress they're under. And so they needed to do what they did. In Malley versus Briggs, it's interesting because the court in that case said qualified immunity is designed to protect from civil liability all but the plainly incompetent or those who knowingly violate the law. They further went to say that if public officials or officers of reasonable competence could disagree on whether the conduct is legal, immunity should still be recognized. So that's saying even if you're a reasonable person in that situation and you're disagreeing with other people in your field, then they're still saying that a qualified immunity should still be in effect. And so it makes no sense that they're using this made up law to hide behind and to advance the terrible actions of these police officers. And so, yeah, we made those arguments. We got pushed back from the other side, and the court just flat out allowed them to get away with it.
Can I just add?
So you would say, no, go on, Ms. Blount, please go on.
Can I just add that not only was he not operating within the scope of the law, but he was drunk. He was inebriated. He had been, before the party bus arrived to take us to our destination, the guest of honor, which was my cousin, everybody else was on the bus, and he was like, has anybody seen my friend Thad? They had to go and find him inside the restaurant at the bar. So he had already gotten a head start, okay? So when this incident took place, he just was blurting out. He was just being belligerent the entire night. It started from the very beginning. His mindset was, he just was really haughty and just really boastful and belligerent the entire night. And when we got to the courts, they literally asked him to demonstrate because he lied. Okay, I can say he lied and said that he was fearful because he tried to make a claim that he tried to make a claim that my brother was trying to fight him. So with one hand, he was trying to fend off, and with the other hand, he used to get the gun. And he was asked to demonstrate that in open court at the grand jury, and he was like, oh, I'm nervous. They were like, oh, I'll wait. But he was not able to reenact where he was able to unholster his off-duty service weapon. He couldn't demonstrate that again for the courts, but that was his testimony. So it's just as a civilian, I'm a veteran, but as a civilian, I don't know how, I just can't fathom how, if this is your testimony and we're asking you to recreate this so that we can see how you felt threatened and that you used this force because you were fearful of your life, then demonstrate how you with one hand unholstered this weapon and shot this civilian, this unarmed man. And he wasn't able to do it. but there was still no consequence. There was still no consequence for that. And again, the service jacket showed that this was not his first time pulling out his service weapon on a civilian. I mean, it's in his service jacket. I've just had so many questions, like about the fact that the firearm used to kill my brother had the serial number filed off of it. Like, these are questions that my family have always had, but we never got answers because it was just put to bed.
Thank you, Ms. Blount. I just want to note that we're at about 8:40, so that means we have about 10 minutes left remaining in the hearing of the case of Juan May. I'll turn it back over to the commissioners for additional questions.
right.
Oh, sorry.
All right, thank you very much. Sorry, this Claire, I just finished in a minute. Now, I was going to say, to both Ms. Blount and Anthony Eiland, is it safe to say now that the U.S. laws and the U.S. courts have elevated police officers above the law? Will it be correct to conclude?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely,
Yes.
they have.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
And I'll say this as far as that's concerned, when we talk about qualified immunity, when we talk about the scope of these police officers' abilities, none of this is, number one, it's not in the Constitution. Number two, it's not a law that was actually passed through legislation. This information strictly came from the courts. It was invented by the courts. And so you have a lot of justices and federal judges who disagree. Some believe that qualified immunity shouldn't even exist because it's made up. And when you have the court system actually basically making laws from the bench, it eliminates an entire branch of our government, their ability to make law. And what they're doing right now is inventing this term and inventing this particular cause of action. It's killing people. And like I said before, until someone does something about this and gets rid of this qualified immunity, these cities are still going to be allowed to hire any and everybody. And a lot of those people are not qualified to be police officers. And they're going to make wrong decisions. They're going to kill people. And at the end of the day, they're going to be protected by this law.
Yes.
Ms. Blount, you are muted.
I'm sorry. I was just, somebody was in the comments was saying that I didn't get sworn in.
Yes, I'll address that before we conclude. But if you wanted to answer any of the questions that were posed, or Commissioner Roberts, I think you also had questions.
I have a question for Mr. Eiland. He said that something has to happen. What changes, what reforms would you like to see in order to stamp out these killings of persons of African descent by police, and to ensure accountability, including prosecution and punishment for these awful acts? I understand you to say qualified immunity should be repealed. It sounds like a common law principle, judge-made law. But what other changes would you recommend?
Well, one of the changes, there are several changes actually, but some of the changes are, number one, I think the legislature, I think we need to start electing progressive people to office, people who recognize and understand what's happening and what's taking place in our court system. And I think once we start electing good legislators to come in and to pass laws to outlaw qualified immunity, that's one thing that can be done. Another thing that can be done is people can start pushing their cities and their municipalities and I know people are doing it now, but we need to do it on a more concerted effort, push them to reform their police officer hiring practices, and to stop basically hiding behind this made up law. I think, and I saw yesterday, and I don't know how far it's going to be. I know, we're all happy that Trump is out of office, but Biden just created a panel, I think yesterday or day before, for Supreme Court reform. And I think, depending on the direction that goes, if we can actually start appointing people to the court that are not on board with qualified immunity and hopefully get that overturned, then those cities that don't decide to reform their police departments and their hiring practices won't be able to hide behind that law anymore once that is overturned and qualified immunity is gotten rid of. Because I guarantee once these cities and these municipalities start getting lawsuits and start getting hit in the pockets, and they start getting held accountable financially for killing, Black men and women, at that point, they're going to start changing their practices and how they hire people. They're going to make sure that they hire qualified people. They're going to make sure that the people that they do hire are executing their duties the way that they're supposed to, and not the way that they want to.
I agree with Anthony. Unless the consequences are mirrored, and the cost for committing such egregious acts are mirrored for people as a whole, there's not going to be a change, because right now those consequences for law enforcement are completely juxtaposed to those who are civilians. And unless they begin to look the same, then there's going to be no accountability. And as for the courts, I can't speak to every case, but in my brother's case and in the Harrison case, there was no acting district attorney. There was no presiding DA, because she was in drug rehab for I think for dependency on whatever substance that she was getting treatment for. So there was no acting district attorney that presided over those cases. And to my knowledge and understanding, my limited knowledge and understanding, a district attorney can actually advise the grand jury to indict based on probable cause alone, if there was a district attorney that was presiding over the case. And I know for a fact that for my brother's case and for the Harrison case, she was not present. So I just feel that these cases just didn't get their due diligence in court. So of course it was no build. But District Attorney Susan Hawk at the time, the Dallas DA, she was in a treatment facility, so she wasn't present. So just little things that I feel these cases don't get their due diligence. I don't think that it should have been able to go through the process without the district attorney being there.
And just to piggyback on what Ms. Blount just said, I was a prosecutor here in Dallas for several years, and I saw how the grand jury process works. And one of the things, and one of the problems that these types of cases have is the DA's offices work hand in hand with police departments all the time. And so when you're working in partnership with these departments, then you basically kind of become beholden to those particular departments. And the fact that, that they work so closely together, they don't ever want to step on each other's toes. And so the DAs don't want to indict police officers for dereliction of duty, and they don't want to have to hold, DPD or any other police department accountable. And so they're always going to try to sweep that stuff under the rug. That's the reason why you don't see a lot of police officers being indicted. That's the reason why you don't see a lot of these police departments being held accountable and liable for their actions and their practices. Is because they work hand in hand, and they simply don't want to step on each other's toes. So they look the other way.
Thank you, Mr. Eiland. At this point, I'm going to note that we are out of time. But before we conclude, I just want to ask Ms. Blount to affirm that her testimony today to the Commission of Inquiry was true and to the best of your knowledge and belief.
Yes, ma'am, it was.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Blount, again, I want to thank you for, just your ability to speak on what was clearly such a tragic and senseless loss. And and I just commend you on how much courage you've shown today in stepping in and being an advocate for your brother. And thank you, Mr. Eiland, for your representation of Mr. May and his family. And thank you to our commissioners, Commissioner Sir Clare Roberts and Commissioner Hannibal Uwaifo. Thank you for your time and your diligent questions. And I want to thank our audience, both here on Zoom and on Facebook, for joining us for this hearing on the death of Juan May at the hands of an off-duty Dallas police officer. That concludes our hearing. They will resume tomorrow, and we'll see you all then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.